What do you mean a trainee fell off the scaffolding last week and no one reported it? Brandon Teller stood frozen in his office, the phone pressed tight to his ear. The accident hadn't been in any of the daily reports, no injury logs, no incident forms, nothing. And yet, here was a whispered message from a quiet HR assistant who couldn't ignore it anymore. Brandon had owned the construction company for 8 years. 17 crews across the state. He bought it from a retiring owner, rebuilt the brand, and expanded it from 5 sites to 17. But lately, something wasn't sitting right. Jobs delayed, budget overruns, and now this an unreported injury? He didn't trust the filtered reports anymore. He needed to see it with his own eyes. There was one crew he'd never visited in person, the Ridgefield site. A sprawling commercial build halfway finished. The crew had a notorious reputation for getting things done fast. That used to sound like a compliment. Now it sounded like a warning. Brandon made the call. I want to go in as a new hire, laborer. No one knows me there, right? No, sir, said his assistant. Most of them were hired in the last 2 years, and the foreman, well, he came from outside, you've never met him. Perfect. The next morning, Brandon tugged on a stained hoodie, worn jeans, and steel toe boots. His shaved beard and dyed hair made him look 10 years younger. The ID badge clipped to his vest read, Ben T. He walked into the Ridgefield trailer at 6 a.m. sharp. The place reeked of burnt coffee and sweat. A tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-leathered skin and a hard jaw was barking orders. All right, listen up. We got 2 weeks to finish this damn framing or we lose the bonus. That means no whining about long days, no dragging your feet, safety gear slows you down, then be careful, don't fall, simple. That was the foreman Troy, no last name given, just Troy. Brandon's gut twisted. New kid, Troy eyed him. You been? Yeah, Brandon said, dropping his voice to a slouched mumble. First day, good, you'll be with Miguel and Wes. Stay out of the way, keep your mouth shut, and don't waste my time. He nodded and followed the 2 workers outside. The air was sharp with sawdust and diesel. The site buzzed with activity, nail guns popping, forklifts beeping, men shouting. But as Brandon looked around, something was off. A guy was working on a 2-story scaffold, zero harness. Another carried drywall up a ladder by himself. No spotters. No helmets. Hey, Brandon muttered to Miguel as they loaded sheets of plywood. Aren't we supposed to be wearing hard hats? Miguel gave him a sideways glance. Yeah, supposed to, but Troy says they're optional if you're fast enough. He doesn't like delays. Brandon clenched his jaw. Later that morning, he saw it happen. A young man couldn't be older than 20 slipped on a wet plank. His foot skidded and he slammed hard into a beam before falling backwards into a pile of insulation. Luckily, it broke the fall, but he didn't move right away. Brandon dropped the board he was holding and ran over. You all right? The kid groaned and sat up slowly, clutching his ribs. Troy stormed over, face red. What the hell happened? He fell, Brandon said, helping the guy up. Troy looked at the kid. You good? Think so, he winced. Then back to work. No paperwork, you cause a delay, I'll send you home with no pay. Brandon opened his mouth, but Miguel subtly shook his head. Don't, he whispered, he'll make it worse. The rest of the day, Brandon watched. Troy ignored basic safety protocols. Workers were rushed. Corners cut, and no one dared speak up. They needed the job. At lunch, Brandon sat with Kayla, the only woman on the crew. She wore beat-up gloves and had sawdust in her hair. She was fast, focused, and clearly exhausted. How long you been here? Brandon asked. 4 months. Longest I've lasted on any crew. Why this one? It pays a little better, but Troy. She shook her head. He's dangerous. Last week I told him I needed a new harness. Mine was fraying. He said to duct tape it or quit. Brandon stared at her. That's not legal. She gave a bitter laugh. Neither is half the stuff he does, but no one's watching, so. He looked around the site again. 17 job sites. 17 crews, and this one was a ticking bomb, but he couldn't act yet, not without seeing it all himself. That night, he sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the wall. His shoulders ached, his hands were raw. But the worst pain came from knowing he'd let this happen. He owned this company, and he hadn't seen what was right under his nose. Tomorrow he'd dig deeper. Because someone had to stop Troy before someone else got hurt or worse. By the second day, Brandon's legs ached from the strain of crouching, lifting, and climbing nonstop. The Ridgefield site didn't slow down, not for weather, fatigue, or injury. He showed up before sunrise again, same hoodie, same boots, blending in with the crew as they gathered around the tool bins. The cold air bit through his sleeves, but Troy was already shouting directions before anyone could complain. "No breaks till this west wall is up," Troy barked, pointing toward the exposed frame. "If you need water, drink it while you're moving." A few workers exchanged glances but said nothing. Brandon noticed one of the younger guys, skinny, maybe 19, had a cough that didn't sound right. He leaned against a stack of sheetrock, trying to catch his breath. "What's your name?" Brandon asked him quietly. "Eric. You all right?" Eric nodded too quickly. "Just dust. Happens every day." Brandon didn't press. He filed the name away. Half an hour later, Troy called for a lift to move pallets of lumber across the lot. A forklift rumbled into view, operated by a heavyset man with a cigarette clamped between his lips. No vest, no flagger, no clearance. He swung the forks wide as he turned, forcing several workers to scatter. "Move your asses," the driver shouted, laughing. Brandon stepped back just in time to avoid getting clipped. Troy didn't flinch. "Watch the corners, Jesse," Troy called lazily. "Try not to kill anybody today." Brandon's hands balled into fists behind his back. Later, while cutting joists on the south end of the site, Brandon worked alongside Kayla again. She hadn't said much that morning, but her movements were sharp and efficient. "You always work solo?" he asked as they measured out the next cut. "Mostly." "Troy says I slow the guys down." Brandon kept his eyes on the saw. "That true?" "No, he just doesn't like that I call him out when he skips steps. Last week, he told me I was lucky to even have the job after I asked for a second set of gloves." A sudden shout from the upper level cut through the air. Brandon looked up in time to see Miguel waving frantically. "Need a second hand up here." "This beam's slipping." Brandon dropped his tape and sprinted toward the scaffold. He climbed fast, grabbing the side rail with one hand and hauling himself up. Miguel was gripping a crossbeam that was tilting under its own weight. The support had slipped from the brace. "Where's the bracket?" Brandon shouted. "Gone," Miguel grunted. There was only one. Together, they managed to hold the piece long enough for a third worker to wedge a temporary support underneath. When they climbed down, their shirts were soaked through with sweat. Troy strolled over, chewing a toothpick. "You two heroes done playing around." "The bracket wasn't installed," Brandon said, wiping his forehead. "That's not a mistake, that's negligence," Troy chuckled. "You want a gold star for noticing. Go grab a hammer and stop wasting time." Miguel opened his mouth, but Brandon stepped in front of him. "You're running this crew into the ground," he said. "And someone's going to get killed if you keep ignoring basic procedure." Troy's face changed. The easy grin vanished. He took a step closer, his voice low. "You don't get to lecture me, new guy. You think you know how to run a crew. I've been doing this since you were in middle school, and you're still doing it wrong." A few heads turned. Jesse, the forklift driver, leaned on the side of the trailer watching. Kayla stood motionless near the sawhorses. Troy looked around, then back at Brandon. "You don't like how I run things? There's the gate. Walk your ass off my site." Brandon didn't move. Troy jabbed a finger at his chest. "Last warning." Then a voice from behind interrupted. "Hey, Troy. You got a minute?" It was Carlos, the site's electrician, stepping down from a ladder. He was older than most of the crew, with a slow, deliberate way of speaking. "Not now." Carlos didn't budge. "We've got exposed wiring in the southeast corner, water's dripping in from the HVAC frame. It's not safe to keep going with the panel open." Troy's voice spiked. "Then cover it with tarp and keep moving. You think I've got time to babysit every little hiccup?" Carlos didn't flinch. "You've got time to stop someone from getting electrocuted." Troy turned bright red. "I swear to God," Brandon stepped between them. "He's right. And if you ignore this, it's not just your job on the line, it's your freedom. You send someone into that corner and they get hurt, you're going to jail. Troy pushed past him, muttering, "You don't run this place." "I do." Brandon let him walk. He turned to Carlos. "Thanks for speaking up." Carlos gave a tired nod. "I've seen too many shortcuts over the years. Someone has to say something." By the time lunch came around, Brandon sat alone on a stack of lumber. He pulled out a sandwich he hadn't touched from the day before. Kayla walked over and sat across from him. "You're not actually new, are you?" she asked. Brandon met her eyes. "No, I'm not." She didn't look surprised. "Figured, new guys don't talk like that. And they don't stand up to Troy." "I needed to see this for myself." She tore open a granola bar, chewed slowly. Then, "What happens now?" Brandon glanced out over the site. Workers moved like machines, careful not to draw attention. A few stole glances in their direction. "I'm not waiting for someone to get hurt again," he said. "But I need to see one more thing before I act." That afternoon, he found it. The storage trailer tucked behind the generator hadn't been opened all day. Brandon waited until Troy was distracted, then slipped inside. Inside were crates of unused safety gear, harnesses, vests, hard hats stacked and unopened. He opened a box. The date on the shipping label was from 7 months ago. As he turned to leave, he heard footsteps. Jesse stood at the door, arms crossed. "You looking for something, Ben?" Brandon closed the box carefully. "Just seeing what was available." Jesse's eyes flicked to the gear. "Don't bother. Troy doesn't hand that out unless corporate shows up." Brandon stepped past him. "That's so? You think this place runs on rules?" Jesse laughed. "It runs on finishing jobs ahead of schedule. That's the only rule that matters." Brandon walked away without saying another word. The sun dipped low by the time the crew began packing up. Brandon walked toward the trailer, but not to clock out. He stepped inside, past the clipboards and the wall calendar, and opened the drawer with the site files. He pulled out the daily logs. Half were missing initials. Several had no incident reports at all. He scanned the dates. The week of the scaffolding fall wasn't even listed. Behind him, Troy entered, wiping grime off his hands. "You lost." Brandon turned, holding the file. "You falsify these logs?" he asked. Troy narrowed his eyes. "What? You remove incident reports, fail to report injuries." Troy's voice dropped. "I don't answer to you." "Get the hell out of my trailer." Brandon stared at him. "You do now." And with that, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his company ID. "Brandon Teller, CEO." Troy froze. "You're done here," Brandon said. "You're fired, effective immediately." Troy's face went pale. "You can't." "I can, and I just did. Pack your things, you're trespassing now." Outside, heads were turning. Word was spreading. The foreman wasn't shouting anymore. Brandon stepped out of the trailer and looked at the crew. "I'll speak with each of you tomorrow, individually. But for now, go home, get some rest, you've earned it." No one moved at first. Then Kayla set down her gear. Miguel followed. One by one, they nodded and walked off site. Brandon stood alone, the cold wind brushing across his face. He looked toward the half-built frame behind him. The work wasn't finished, but the real rebuild was just beginning. Brandon arrived at the Ridgefield site just after 5 the next morning. The sky was still dark, the gravel lot silent except for the low hum of the generator near the tool shed. He leaned against the front fender of his truck, arms folded across his chest, watching headlights appear one by one as the crew pulled in. No one said anything at first. A few paused when they saw him standing there, dressed now in a high-vis vest with the company logo stitched above his name. No hoodie, no alias. Just the man who'd fired their foreman the day before. Kayla was the first to approach. "You really coming back?" He straightened. "I never left." She looked at him for a long second, then gave a sharp nod and walked toward the trailer. Eric trailed behind her, limping slightly, though he tried to hide it. His cough had worsened. Brandon followed them in. The trailer was quiet except for the sound of boots hitting the floorboards. Miguel sat at the folding table, sipping from a dented thermos. Carlos was by the whiteboard, arms crossed, reading the unfinished day's schedule. Everyone else stood along the walls, unsure whether to sit, speak, or wait. Brandon stood at the front, behind the scratched-up desk Troy used to commandeer. "Nobody's swinging a hammer today," he said. "Not until we have a real conversation," he waited. "I spent 2 days working beside you," he continued. "Not watching, not checking logs, working. And what I saw made it clear that this crew has been left completely on its own, no oversight, no support, no protection." Still, no one spoke. "I'm not going to pretend that changes overnight," he said. "But it starts today." Carlos stepped forward. "You replacing Troy?" "That depends," Brandon said. "Do you want to work under someone like him again?" Carlos shook his head once. Brandon turned to the others. "The Ridgefield job's been behind because of bad planning, not bad labor. You were pushed to meet impossible deadlines without the right tools or time. That ends now. First task is to get this site back up to code. That means full PPE, functional harnesses, and compliance across every station." A voice from the side spoke up. It was a welder named Ron, older with a shaved head and a scar across one brow. "And what happens to the backlog? If we slow down, corporate's gonna come down on us hard." "I'll deal with corporate," Brandon said. "You deal with doing the work right." Ron studied him, then nodded slowly. Brandon turned to Kayla. "You said something to me the other day about not being given proper gear. That won't happen again. Come with me." She followed him out the trailer and across the lot to the storage trailer, the one filled with untouched safety gear. He unlocked it and flipped on the light. "Pick what you need," he said, "and let the others know. No one should be reusing torn gloves or taping together old harnesses." She stepped inside, brushing her fingers across the boxes like she didn't trust they were real. "You had all this?" "I didn't know it was sitting unused," he said. "But I do now." Back outside, Brandon pulled out his phone and called the main office. "Get me a certified safety inspector on site by this afternoon," he said. "And send over a field supervisor from another crew, temporarily. I need someone objective to evaluate the workflow." By 9, the site had shifted. Workers wore full kits. The scaffold was cordoned off for inspection. Jesse, the forklift driver, stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the changes with narrowed eyes. Brandon approached him. "You planning to work today?" "I'm waiting to see how long this cleanup show lasts." Brandon looked him over. "You've got a reputation for cutting corners. That stops now." Jesse laughed under his breath. "You think barking orders from the trailer makes you one of us?" "I don't need to be one of you," Brandon said. "I need this site to be safe and legal." Jesse's tone shifted. "You fire Troy, fine, but don't come in here acting like you're saving us. You weren't here when we were pulling double shifts in the rain to hit deadlines you signed off on." Brandon didn't blink. "You're right, I wasn't. That's on me. But you don't get to use that as an excuse to endanger everyone else. We've been doing it this way for years." Nobody complained. They didn't feel safe enough to. Jesse shook his head, turned, and walked toward the trailer. Brandon watched him go, then turned back to the crew. Miguel was helping Eric adjust a fall harness. Kayla was distributing new gloves to a pair of temp workers who'd arrived late. At noon, the safety inspector showed up. Brandon walked her through the site himself. She took notes quickly, pointing out a half-dozen compliance issues they'd need to address before continuing the build. Nothing catastrophic, all fixable. But each one was another reminder of how far things had slipped. When they returned to the trailer, Jesse was gone. Brandon found him 10 minutes later, leaning against the far side of the generator, smoking. "You took off your vest," Brandon said. "I'm not sticking around to be micromanaged by someone who's never laid brick in his life. I spent 2 days pulling lumber with you. 2 days doesn't undo 2 years of being ignored." Brandon nodded once. "Then maybe it's time for a clean break." Jesse flicked his cigarette into the gravel. "You firing me? I'm letting you go. There's a difference." Jesse didn't argue. He just walked off toward the lot. Back inside the trailer, Miguel glanced up. "He gone?" Brandon nodded. "He's not a good fit for us anymore." Carlos raised a brow. "You planning to replace him in time?" "For now, we scale back, prioritize safety, quality over speed." They worked through the rest of the afternoon in smaller teams. Brandon checked in with each station, taking notes, asking questions. He wasn't there to hover, he was there to understand. At one point he found Eric sitting on a crate behind the framing area, coughing into his sleeve. Brandon crouched beside him. "You need a break," Eric nodded, pale. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" "I didn't want to be the guy who held everyone up." Brandon stood. "Come with me." He drove Eric to the urgent care 2 blocks away, waited while he was seen. The doctor confirmed bronchial inflammation, not serious yet, but aggravated by dust exposure and lack of rest. Brandon paid the copay out of pocket and told the receptionist to send the bill to headquarters moving forward. In the truck on the way back, Eric sat quietly, hands in his lap. "You could have ignored all this," he said. "I did. For too long." Eric looked out the window, then back at him. "You think it'll actually stay different?" "I don't know," Brandon said, "but I'm going to make damn sure it doesn't go back." When they returned, the sun was low behind the steel frame of the main structure. The crew was packing up. Kayla met him halfway across the lot. "Carlos wants to know if he can adjust tomorrow's schedule. Said he's got a better sequence for the wiring. Tell him to run it by me first thing in the morning." She nodded, then hesitated. "You're really sticking around," Brandon looked out over the job site. "Every day I can." She gave him a look, not quite gratitude, not quite trust, but something in between. He knew this wasn't over. One crew fix didn't mean 17 were fine, but this was where it started, not in a boardroom, not in a spreadsheet. Right here, in the dirt and the steel and the voices of people who'd been ignored too long. 2 weeks later, the Ridgefield site looked like a different world, not perfect, not easy, but different. The first thing Brandon did after removing Troy was transfer 2 experienced foremen from neighboring crews to temporarily oversee operations in rotating shifts. One of them, a quiet, detail-oriented man named Len, had a reputation for being a stickler about compliance and running a clean site. The other, Desiree, was younger, sharp-eyed, and had led a successful hospital build in Tacoma. Both were respected, neither cared about shortcuts. Brandon didn't step back into his office after the reveal. He stayed. Not as a boss hovering, not as a laborer hauling plywood, but as a visible presence who asked questions, listened, and made decisions on site when needed. He kept a cot in the trailer some nights. He'd wake up at 4:30, walk the grounds with a coffee and a clipboard, and watch how the crew operated when no one thought they were being watched. Word spread fast across the other job sites, some of it admiration, some of it suspicion. But at Ridgefield, the shift was real. Kayla began leading morning safety checks with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Her suggestions were implemented without resistance. She still worked with her gloves on, but now she was the one others went to when something didn't look right. Len quietly offered her a crew lead role by the end of week 2, and she accepted without ceremony. Miguel took on mentorship of the newest hires. He wasn't loud about it. He just showed up 20 minutes early, reviewed tasks with them, and stood nearby when they tried something new. His work was cleaner now, less rushed, and he no longer watched his back for reprimands that never made sense. As for Eric, he was given medical leave with full pay for 10 days. On his return, he was reassigned to lighter duties, working in the equipment shed doing inventory and prep. He didn't try to hide his cough anymore, and the other workers didn't treat him like a burden. He moved slower, but he moved without fear. One afternoon, Brandon called Desiree over to the side of the structure, where HVAC framing was underway. "How's it running in your eyes?" he asked, hands in his jacket pockets. She adjusted her hard hat. "Still behind schedule, but no one's skipping inspections anymore. The attitude's changed, not scared, just focused. You think it can be salvaged if you give it the time it needs. You cut this crew a break now, they'll pay it back tenfold by the finish. But don't rush them again, they've been bruised." He nodded once. "I hear you." That Friday, Brandon called for a full site meeting just before lunch. He stood near the main trailer, not on a platform, not behind a podium, just standing level with everyone else. "I've been here for 15 days," he said. "And I've learned more about my own company in that time than I did in the last 18 months. The crew stood in loose formation, some eating, some with arms folded, all listening. I saw systems fail. I saw people ignored. I saw fear used as a leadership tactic. That ends here. Not just at Ridgefield, everywhere." He looked around. "There's going to be a new policy in place starting next week. Every site will have an anonymous reporting line that goes straight to my desk. No filtering, no middlemen. If something's wrong, I want to know first." He paused. "Troy's leadership wasn't an isolated problem, it was a result of me being too far removed. I own that, and I'm fixing it." A few heads nodded. One of the newer hires, a man named Devont who'd kept mostly to himself, raised his hand. Brandon glanced over. "Go ahead. Are we going to get regular site visits now from people who actually listen?" "Yes. Starting next month, every active site will be visited by a rotating panel, one safety officer, one worker from another site, and one person from admin, cross-check. No warning." "No prep." Another hand went up. Carlos, "What about training?" he asked. "A lot of guys coming in don't know the basics. That's not their fault, but they're expected to just figure it out. We're launching mandatory training for all new field hires, 2 days minimum. That includes safety, equipment, and process walkthroughs. No one starts on a site without it." Ron crossed his arms. "And when schedules get tight again, when the push comes to finish early like always, what happens then?" Brandon looked him in the eyes. "Then we finish on time, not early. Bonuses will no longer be tied to speed, they'll be tied to safety records and quality inspections." A silence settled over the lot. It wasn't disbelief, it was weight. Real, heavy change. Brandon continued. "There's one more thing. We're creating a field leadership program open to anyone who's been on a crew longer than 6 months. You apply, you're evaluated, and if you're accepted, we train you to lead. We're not importing managers who don't understand the work anymore. We're building leaders from within." He stepped back. "That's it for now. Back to work at lunch bell, and thank you for sticking this out." As the crew dispersed, Kayla walked up beside him. "You write all that down, or was it off the cuff?" "I've been writing it in my head for 2 weeks. She tilted her head toward the scaffold where 2 apprentices were measuring distances. "You're not going to be able to do this at every site." "No," he said, "but I can start by listening better. And putting people who care in the right places." She didn't say anything for a moment, then she nodded once and walked away. Later that day, Brandon was in the trailer reviewing the updated workflow chart when Desiree stepped in. "Got a minute?" He motioned to the chair across from him. She sat. "You mean what you said out there?" "I wouldn't have said it if I didn't." "Good, because you're going to get pushback. Some of the other foremen are already grumbling, saying the bar's getting too high." He leaned back. "Then they can raise their game or hand over the reins." She smiled slightly. "You'll need people to help enforce it. You can't be everywhere." "I've got a shortlist in mind. You're on it." She raised an eyebrow. "I didn't apply." "You don't need to. You've proven your worth." She stood. "Then give me 2 more weeks here. Let me prep Kayla to take over. She's got it in her." "You think she's ready?" "She will be. She just needs the space to grow into it." Brandon nodded. "Then let's make it happen." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying sawdust and grit across the lot. The crew worked steadily, movements deliberate but unhurried. No one was yelling. No one was rushing. No one was cutting corners. Brandon stepped out and walked the perimeter one last time before heading out. As he passed the scaffold, Eric waved from the ground level, clipboard in hand, checking inventory like it mattered because now it did. By the time he reached his truck, the sun had dropped low behind the steel skeleton of the building. The shape of it was starting to take form, beams locked, rivets set, concrete dry. The job would take longer than projected. The budget would climb. The investors would need explanations, but the structure would be sound, and so would the people building it.